Please recommend it to your colleagues and friends. Thank you, and over to you, George.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'm George Zedgenidze, co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group of the Scaling Up Community of Practice, and I would like to take this opportunity to formally introduce and offer a warm welcome to my co-chair, Amar Bhattacharya, who will be presiding over his first working group meeting today. Amar and myself will be both moderating today's session. By way of introduction, Amar is a senior fellow of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He has had a long and successful career, actively participating in global economic discussions, and has held positions at the World Bank and as director of the Group of 24. He brings expertise in the areas of global economy, development finance, global governance, and the links between climate and development. We're very fortunate to have him as a co-chair. Welcome, Amar. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants. While we wish we were gathering in person, the silver lining is that the chance to use this year's format to include many more of you from around the world. To provide a bit of background to this working group, this is the 9th working group of the Scaling Up Communities of Practice, the newest of all, having held our first meeting in June 2020. This is the second ever meeting. As outlined in the working group's TOR, our objective is to create a community of practitioners and analysts focused on knowledge sharing, collaboration, and innovation in scaling up climate change interventions. Based on discussions in our first meeting and survey feedback, this working group will now focus on 2 work streams going forward. First, scaling up initiatives and lessons learned by frontline actors and financiers. And second, systemic reform issues at the national, regional, and especially global level. Our meeting today will be split into 2 sessions. The first session, moderated by myself, will have 2 keynote speakers, as already introduced by Johannes, and will focus on introducing each of the 2 work streams. The second session will be moderated by Amar and have 2 guest speakers presenting on areas related to each of the 2 work streams. Both sessions will be closed with a brief Q&A. In our first session today, we're fortunate to have 2 very distinguished speakers, and I'm very pleased to first introduce Lord Nicholas Stern. Lord Stern is I.G. Patel Professor, Economics and Government, co-director of the India Observatory, and chair of Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change and the Environment at the LSE. He is a member of the high-level advisory group for COP26 of the UNFCCC. Previously, Lord Stern was chief economist at both EBRD and World Bank. He was also head of UK Government Economic Service between 2003-2007 and produced the landmark Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change. He was knighted for services to economics in 2004 and made a life peer in 2007, and appointed Companion of Honors for services to economics, international relations, and tackling climate change in 2017. Having published more than 15 books and 100 articles, Lord Stern's research and publications focus on economics of climate change, economic development and growth, economic change theory, tax reform, public policy, and role of the state in economies in transition. We're very grateful to have him here today with us. Lord Stern, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Thank you very much, George. And it's a great pleasure to see so many friends on this call. George, you missed out one crucial thing, although it was a rather long and very kind introduction. And the most important thing is that most of my work in this area is joint with Amar Bhattacharya. And that should be underlined in all this. Now, there are some slides available, and I hope they will be made available to all those who want them. But I'm not going to go through them in detail. What I'll try to do is to highlight exactly the subject of our discussion, going to scale, in all the 3 sections. So I'm not asking for slides to be put up in the first section. I'll ask for a couple in the second section and 2 or 3 in the third. But let me give the thrust of the first section of what I want to say. Actually, could you put up the slide with the structure? If that would be helpful. Is that all right? Next slide. That's it. So there's 3 parts of what I want to say, and I'll refer to a couple of slides in parts 2 and 3, but I'm trying to highlight the subject of the day, indeed the subject of this whole group, which is scaling up. So the first point that I wanted to make is that it's the science and the economics together which give us the urgency of the action on scale. The world's infrastructure will double in the next 15 or 20 years. If that looks anything like the infrastructure that we have at the moment, then we can say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone well below 2 degrees. So that tells us that we have to act quickly from the point of view of the infrastructure, and the science itself is becoming ever more urgent in the sense and pointing to scale, in the sense that the things that we were worried about look like still more worrying than we thought. The effects are coming through more quickly and more severely than we had in mind. And all the IPCC reports, a half dozen or so that we've had, each one over time since 1990 is getting more worrying because these effects are just more severe and happening faster than we thought, even though we have been quite careful in terms of the science. So the urgency and scale come from the combination of the science and economics. The technology of going to scale is, on the other hand, ever more promising. So science more worrying, the technology more promising, and pointing to our ability to go to scale in a big way. I won't rehearse it all for you. You know the plunging costs of renewables, our ability to manage digitally complex systems. I'll come back to that. There's so much that the technology is now allowing us to do, which would be unimaginable 13, 14, 15 years ago. I mean, remember, the iPhone is only 13 years old. We've seen plunging costs of renewables, and you can go on with the list. So that's the science and the technology. Now, the public and private action is very interesting. It's very important here that in addition to the momentum in the technology, we have strong momentum in public and private action. In other words, we have something that can be accelerated and is indeed beginning to accelerate towards the kind of scale that we need. Country after country now has gone to a commitment of net zero. Very importantly, China committed to carbon neutrality by 2060 in September. And this week, we've had Japan and South Korea committing to net zero by 2050. There's a real momentum there. Of course, we already have Europe and the UK and many, many other countries. And who knows, in the next couple of months, we can just dream of having the similar kind of commitment from the United States as well. So that's a story of urgency and scale required in the science and the economics, momentum and opportunity in the technology, momentum and opportunity in public action, but it's there in private action too, firm after firm committing to net zero. Mukesh Ambani and Reliance in July. Earlier this year, we've had Google Alphabet. At the beginning of this year, we had Microsoft. And further, there's growing recognition that firms that behave responsibly in this area will do well. Even Larry Fink gets that. And we've seen that countries that do well in this area may well grow faster. So there is not a spitting contest between responsibility on the one hand and economic growth and development on the other. More and more, both at the country level and at the firm level, we're seeing these come together. Now, let me turn to the second part of what I want to say. And if it's possible to identify slide 13, if you could put up slide 13 in this deck, that would be very helpful. So one way of going to scale, indeed one absolute necessity in this story of going to scale, is in the complex systems that drive all this. I haven't got the time to go into any great detail, but transport, energy, cities and land use, and of course these overlap. These are complicated systems. Of course, when you integrate those into cities and land use, it's still more complex, but we're much better now potentially at recognizing what we need to do. Some part of it will be design, some part of it standards, some part of it digital management and artificial intelligence, but these are all crucial elements of going to scale. Next slide, please, slide 14. Now, another perspective on scale is the whole macro story for the world as a whole. We have a world with fantastic investment opportunities and a world with very strong savings. The challenge, of course, is to translate the investment opportunities into real investment programs and get the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. So translating investment opportunities into real programs is all about what many of us who've been working in the MDBs for much of our lives would recognize. You know, the investment climate, the policy environment, the institutional environment, and the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time is about reducing, managing, and sharing risk, which is a crucial part of what MDBs, DF and DFIs have to do. And very importantly, being here today to emphasize the importance of Yannick's the Global Climate Fund, Yannick's output as part, a crucial part of this story. So the Green Climate Fund. So this is a story then of macro environment at the global level of moving to scale, and we can see big parts of what we have to do. Now, if you could go to the third section and slide 16, please. Now, I've just got 3 points here which are about going to scale. The first is the integration of the different sources. Those of you who were in Addis Ababa in the summer of 2015 will remember that we had really had quite a productive gathering about how you put together the key sources of public finance and private finance. The domestic budget story, the international finance through the MDBs and the climate funds and the DFIs, domestic private investment and international private investment. So a big part of scaling up should be the quite explicit discussion, examination, policy and institutional approaches to how those sources of finance can get together and complement each other, taking risks in the right place, or choosing to go into the private sector in the right place and so on. But we have to see the integration of these different forms of finance as a key part of the whole story of scaling up. Next slide, please. In doing that, the idea of the country platform is absolutely fundamental. The idea of a country platform is where you have a country setting out a basic structure of the investment programs and growth paths that it's looking for, particularly in the area of infrastructure. That allows private sector investment to see how their investment would fit in with others. In infrastructure particularly, you need to know what's going on elsewhere to design well the kind of infrastructure investment you need to make. You know, if you're looking at railways, you need to be thinking about ports. If you're looking at railways, you need to think about cities. If you're looking at electricity, you need to think about where the demand is going to be. So country platforms are absolutely crucial in this story. And the more we can get country platforms using the same kind of principles, and of course cities and in other ways using the same kind of standards, then we will facilitate going to scale. But the country platform is an absolutely central element in all this. Next slide, please. Now, right kind of finance in the right place at the right time is crucially about the MDBs. And there we have to be very explicit that their current size is nowhere near big enough for the kind of change that we have to make. That is something that many of us have been arguing for some time. In this COVID context, the argument that was already overwhelming becomes, if you like, overwhelming squared. I mean, it is just an enormous crisis that the world is facing. The finance ministries of the world are very much looking inwards, but they have to look much more strongly in a multilateral way. And we probably have to triple the lending ability of the MDBs, moving strongly there, of course, including the climate funds, and a big expansion in the DFIs. We have to work out how big that expansion will have to be, but they're crucial to the task of building country platforms. They're crucial to the whole story of integrating different forms of finance. They're crucial to getting the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time, in particular, of course, sharing and reducing, managing the risks. This is a moment when they can play a very important role, just as they were conceived in large measure at a global scale after the Second World War. And this is a similar kind of international crisis and demand to rebuild and to build in a better way looking to the future. So this should be the decade of the MDBs and the DFIs. They will need to get together in a much more constructive way, perhaps, than they've done in the past, alongside the expansion of their ability to lend. And that should, in large measure, be driven by their main shareholders. That's why the coalition of finance ministers on climate action is so important. That's why the G7 and the G20s of 2021 and 2022 are so important, not only to get the whole global story of sustainable recovery and the drive to transformation of growth, not only to get that going, but also to take a decision that within that story, they're going to get behind the international financial institutions. And of course, we all know the amazing value proposition that they are. For a one-shot 40 billion, you could, and these are Amar's calculations here, for one-shot 40 billion, we could double the finance flows to around 150 billion. And then by relaxing the extremely conservative gearing ratios to just very conservative gearing ratios, you could expand still further, other ways to use their capital assets better, and of course, very important multipliers with the private sector, which would be a key part of this story. So we need a grand bargain with the MDBs, DFIs, and their shareholders. And that is going to be an absolutely crucial part of the whole story of scaling up. If we do all this, then there's a chance of building a Marshall Plan for the next 2 or 3 decades, which could play an absolutely crucial role in going to the scale that we need, driving all the way to net zero and reducing poverty on all its dimensions around the world. So let me finish at that point. And the last slides of all have got reference in it because I'm an academic, and you have to give references to the claims that are here. But this is the place in which I'd like to stop, and looking forward very much to listening to Yannick and his very important activities.
Thank you very much, Lord Stern, for that very insightful presentation. We will now present the second presentation by Yannick and have a few minutes for Q&A. I'm delighted to introduce Yannick Lemarec, Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Yannick has over 30 years of international experience in climate change, development, finance, and their interrelationship. He previously served as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Programs in UN Women between 2015 and 2018. As executive coordinator for UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office in New York from 2013 to 2015, Yannick was responsible for the design and administration of approximately 100 United Nations trust funds supporting humanitarian, post-conflict development and climate action in over 100 countries. He holds a PhD from the University of Paris in environmental sciences and has authored several publications in the field of risk management, renewable energy, climate finance, eco-benefits between human rights, gender equality, and climate action. Dear Yannick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. I was planning to share my screen for the PowerPoint, but is it possible for you to operate it from your end? Okay, if not, I will do it. I will share my screen. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I will try in this presentation to very quickly summarize the approach of the Green Climate Fund to foster and scale up climate innovations. But first, maybe a few words on the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund was established in 2015. Our mandate is to foster a paradigm shift toward low emission climate resilient development in developing countries. And so far we have allocated $6.2 billion and for a total of $21 billion with the co-financing. And in the coming 4 years, we should be able to allocate between 2 to 3 additional $1 billion a year. So how do we implement our mandate of promoting a paradigm shift in developing countries toward low emission climate resilient development? Our main approach is to foster and scale up innovation in order to create green inclusive markets and shift financial flows from high emission climate vulnerable development to low emission climate resilient development. In order to achieve this change, we focus on 4 main types of outcomes. The first outcome is to create an enabling policy environment, an enabling capacity environment for transformational change, for innovation. And it can be as much about coming up with a long-term planning approach than developing capacity or new type of instrument. Our second outcome is to support proof of concept for new innovation. And so it can be a technological innovation, it can be an institutional innovation, it can be a policy innovation, or it can be a financing innovation. And once an innovation is successful, we try in our outcome 3 to scale it up, to bring it to size. And if we reach size, after our fourth and last outcome is to try to basically replicate it worldwide and shift very large financial flow toward low emission climate resilient development. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is this huge focus on innovation? In a sense, because right now, based on current trend, we are not to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We are not to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and we are not to achieve the Paris Agreement. Let me take a couple of examples, 2 SDGs that are particularly relevant to the discussion today. The first one, SDG 4, education. Based on current trend, we are not to achieve the 2030 goal of universal quality education, primary and secondary education for all boys and girls before 2080, 50 years after the deadline. And this, what does it mean is that the world will be deprived from the innovators, scientists, economists, political activists, policy decision makers that we need to foster innovation. Also, the consumers will be facing major capacity constraint to be able to adapt and adapt to innovation. So this is for SDG 4. If we take SDG 13, climate change, the situation is not much better. In the 1950s, we thought that we had about 6,000 years before we would cross the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Now we could cross it in the 2050s. In 100 years, rather than 6,000 years. And not only are we going far faster than we thought toward this threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, but in addition, the impact will be much, much larger than what we thought. 20 years ago, we thought that we will have to have an increase in average global temperature of between 4 to 6 degrees Celsius before some unique ecosystem could disappear. Today, we believe that a 2 degrees Celsius increase could be enough to wipe out 90% of coral reef and endanger the livelihood of about 500 million people. So we are not on track. However, the good news is that we know that the trends are not a certainty. Trends can be broken by innovation. For example, one single institutional innovation at the turn of the 19th century, the limited stock company, was enough to enable innovators and financiers and industrialists to pool resources and to share risk to basically foster, finance the factories, the railways of the first industrial revolution and the following 2 other industrial revolutions. We know that, for example, one cultural innovation, women's rights, was enough to avoid a major societal collapse. The second women's rights movement of the 1960s gave to women a choice to decide whether or not they would want to have kids and how many they would want. And this was enough to diffuse the population bomb and the mass famines that Paul Ehrlich had predicted in 1968. And of course, technologies. As mentioned by Lord Stern, the cost of renewable energy technologies has gone down by more than an order of magnitude over the past 2 decades. And so suddenly it has become one of the most cost-effective solutions for energy access in almost everywhere in the world. And what was the dream of a 100% renewable energy grid only a couple of decades ago today could become a reality. Now, one of the key issues with innovation is that we know that it's not preordained, it does not obligatory materialize at the right moment to avoid a catastrophe. And for example, when the US Clean Air Act was passed in 1970s, there was a lot of enthusiasm about it. We thought that this piece of legislation will be enough to foster the type of innovation to resolve all local air pollution within a decade. And not only 50% of the Americans are still living in areas that do not meet the minimum local air pollution standard, but in addition, since we have moved from local air pollution concerns to global air pollution concerns, such as the ozone layer and climate change. We know also that innovation is not neutral, it does not benefit the poor and the rich alike, it does not benefit women and men alike. And for example, if the second industrial revolution was fostered by electricity, for the 1 billion people who do not have access to electricity today, it could as well never have happened. We know also that innovation can create new unforeseen problems of its own. And in the 1920s, the CFCs were touted as miracle components, chemical compounds to replace the explosive ammoniac refrigerants that we had at that time. In the 1970s, we realized that these miracle compounds were actually endangering the ozone layer and were creating an existential threat for life on Earth. So in less than 50 years, we moved from miracle compounds to existential threat. And today, there are a number of new technologies that could lead to a total repeat, such as, for example, most of the leading geoengineering technologies. And last, we know that technology and innovation per se do not have agency. Humans have agency. And whether or not it will benefit everybody or a few, whether or not it's likely to create major problems or not, will depend on the type of policy framework we put in place. For example, there is a lot of hope pinned on the autonomous vehicle. The car is either 94% of the time autonomous vehicle could get 80% of the car out of the roads. This could enable us to completely redesign our urban areas. We could convert the parking lots of today into the parks of tomorrow. This could serve as storm surge for floods. This could also lower temperature in case of a heat wave, etc. So it could dramatically reduce emission and increase the resilience of an urban area. But this is only one scenario with autonomous vehicle. There is another scenario, which is that because we won't have to suffer the cost of the driver, the cost of autonomous vehicle could be so low that it will displace people from public transport to individual autonomous vehicle. And we could end up with a dramatic increase in automobiles on the road, dramatic traffic jam, reduction in fiscal revenues of urban government and their capacity to maintain the urban infrastructure, and the millions of drivers being out of job. So, and the difference between the two is most likely the type of policy frameworks that we will put in place. Not surprisingly, one of the key objectives of the Green Climate Fund is to foster and scale up innovation, to break trends and ensure that we meet the Paris Agreement, but also to foster an innovation that is inclusive and responsible. And so we have 6 investment criteria when we look at a project. One of the 6 is the paradigm shift potential. And so right from the beginning, for each of our projects, we try to figure out what is the likelihood that this project can be replicated and scaled up. And so one of the things that we ask from all our project proponents is that they come with a theory of change for scaling up the innovation, for basically a scalability pathway. And we have investment criteria scorecard that enable us to put basically a number behind the likelihood that we will end up with a paradigm shift, behind the likelihood that an innovation will be scaled up. And currently we are working with our board on finalizing a new monitoring and evaluation system that will not only enable us to track how many millions of tons of GHG emissions we have to reduce, but also the likelihood of basically the likelihood of diffusion of the climate innovation that we will have been supporting. And to make this presentation maybe a little bit less theoretical, I would like to take a couple of examples of projects. The first one is one seawater project in Chile. It's a $1.1 billion investment. And so this project is to basically use solar energy during the day to pump water from the sea to a high natural point, and at night it will generate hydroelectricity. The net result is that this project will be generating electricity 24 hours a day. Suddenly, solar energy will become a base load energy, and we will be able to remove the issue of intermittency. And with this natural storage, we can move faster toward a 100% renewable energy-based grid. The potential of such a technology, seawater solar technology, is gigantic. The total replication potential could be around 340, 350 gigawatts, basically the equivalent of 340, 350 nuclear plants, almost the entire world nuclear parks. And when we got this innovation, we got very interested in this technology, in its huge potential in order to scale up the energy transformation. And we worked with the project proponent on making sure that this will be inclusive and responsible. And notably, With the project proponent, we make sure that this will meet our environmental and social safeguard, our gender policy, our indigenous people policies. And so we use a number of different upstream engagement techniques in order to try to redesign the project to maximize the development co-benefits. So in addition to providing electricity, renewable electricities to the grid, we have also a desalination plant that will provide safe water to the local communities. Now, one thing for me, which is extremely important with this project, is it's also demonstrate that often it's impossible to foster one innovation on its own. Here we have a strong technological innovation, but this technological innovation will not have seen the light of the day without two additional innovation. One was the fact that with the GCF ended up providing $60 million of first loss equity. And in order for the project proponent to be able to finalize the feasibility studies and come with the bid bonds. And there's $60 million first loss equity enables them to get $400 million of senior equity and $600 million of commercial loans from Mitsubishi Bank, the largest Japanese bank. But this project, in a lot of regard, is basically pushing the development front line of blended finance. If the project goes well, after 5 years, we can sell our share to institutional investors and get back our money. And there we will be using public money in a truly catalytic manner, where we use public money to accelerate private investment and we get back our public money. Another innovation was a private sector PPA, private sector power purchase agreement, where basically rather than having to rely on the states to provide a guarantee of takeoff for they say 10, 20 or 30 years, it's actually another private concern. So we are speaking about a totally private driven scaling up here. But for this project to see the light of the day, we needed 3 innovations. We needed to think about innovation as an integrated package of a requirement. Another example that I would like to take and to close this presentation is the Climate Investor One. Right, this project is basically this project provides financing for every single stage of a project cycle, and notably for the pre-feasibility and development stage. And this is particularly important because it's next to impossible for a lot of promoters to get that money. Everything has to be based on equity. It's very difficult for developers to get development funds. And it's a major barrier to entrepreneurs. When we speak about shifting financial flows from the present economy to a low emission climate resilient development economy, when we speak about aligning finance, we often speak about removing the barriers to the supply of finance by financier. And so we speak about, for example, climate risk disclosure, carbon pricing to internalize the external cost of carbon, new standard and certification for new type of financial products. But the experience of GCF shows that it is as important to remove the barriers to the demand for climate finance from entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs faced a number of problems that are different from the financiers. And notably, for them, if it takes them 5 years to get a sitting license for their projects, because we need the approval from 27 agencies, no projects will see the light of the day. If they do not have the technical capacity in the country, no project will see the light of the day. If they cannot get finance for all the feasibility studies or the bid bonds, like in Chile, no project will see the light of the day. And that's the reason why we often find ourselves in the very bizarre situation where you have suddenly financiers that are willing to finance green project, because let's say, as mentioned by Lord Stern, they have basically pressure from their shareholders to do so, or they have a commitment to a certain percentage of their portfolio invested in green product, and they don't find project. and they don't find project, because why there are plenty of investment opportunities, you have no bankable projects because the barriers to entrepreneurs have not been removed. And so this project is an example about how GCF tried to basically come with new innovations to both remove the barriers to supply of money from financier and demand for climate finance from entrepreneurs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank you very much. And I would now like to open the floor for questions and answers. Can I please ask the participants to raise their hand using the function of requesting the floor? And we'll take the first couple of questions. And we did have one question that was posted in the chat, so maybe I can read it out loud. It's for Lord Stern. What about regional platforms? How can these regional platforms be more useful to leverage impact of country platforms? That was a question. If Lord Stern, if you could maybe take this question, we'll wait for others to come in. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Maria, for the question, and thank you, Yannick, for a very interesting, insightful talk. And the short answer, Maria, is yes. Regional platforms are a very good idea. Making them work, we all know, can be complicated, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And for example, the European Union, in many ways, is a story of trying to get regional platforms as well as country platforms. Back in the day, I worked a lot in East Africa, and there was a big attempt there to get the East African community to have a more integrated transport system. So I think those things are of fundamental importance, particularly I think in Africa, where you have more than 50 countries with borders becoming very arbitrary, or have become very arbitrary as a result of a very difficult colonial history. So I do think that regional platforms are very important, but we do have to note that they can be difficult to put together. And I think that's one of the purposes of the MDBs and the climate funds, to help those regional actions occur, because they're vitally important in many ways, but particularly around transport and energy and water.
Thank you very much, Lord Stern, for your response. And we have Florence Reed requesting the floor. Florence, could you please introduce yourself and keep the question succinct? Thank you. We can't hear you, Florence. Could you please unmute yourself?
Is it possible that Florence is centrally muted?
Could be. Katie, could we please ask you to help from your end if that's possible? We can't hear Florence.
Florence, you need to make sure your microphone is connected. It's nothing on our end, it's your audio.
And if yeah, let's try that. Otherwise, you can type your question in the chat function. Thank you.
Florence, we still cannot hear you. If you could make sure your microphone is please connected.
Hello?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I'm sorry. So you didn't hear my question. I'm sorry. You can hear me now?
Yeah, we couldn't hear anything. So if you don't mind, could you please once again introduce yourself and pose your question?
Okay,
so
I'm
much.
sorry. That's embarrassing. I'm Florence Reed. I'm with Sustainable Harvest International, and I was noticing there's a lot of focus on reduction of carbon emissions, which is obviously critical. But it also seems to me that we will continue to see global warming from the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so I wondered if there were any thoughts about scaling up practices such as regenerative agroecology that could draw down carbon that's already in the atmosphere while also reducing the significant emissions that we currently experience from conventional farming practices, and also at the same time increase food production, which would be a nice bonus. So just any thoughts on that would be of interest to me. Thank you.
Do you want me to go first, Yannick, or would you like to go?
Nick, you first. I will take after.
Okay. I think, I mean, Florence, I mean, the short answer is yes, there must be great potential there. So much of what we should be trying to do, and where I think going to scale can be very important, is putting together development, mitigation, and resilience or adaptation. I mean, the system of root intensification for rice is an obvious example where you don't flood the paddy field and you reduce the methane being released from the paddy field, but at the same time, you save on resources, the energy and the water, and you have a system that's more robust. In cities, public transport is a story of development, mitigation, and resilience put together as well. But focusing particularly on land systems, it seems to me there's so much that we can do with, but that will involve major reform on scale, you know, the topic of this discussion. Our agricultural subsidy systems probably cost $600 or $700 billion a year, depending on how you do the sums. And what you get for that is in large measure degraded land, poisoned rivers, and deforestation. By redesigning those and making much more incentive not to just create degraded land by soil mining, but restoring degraded land by investing in it, you could make an enormous difference. And scale does matter. I remember long ago, the wonderful Jürgen Vögele, whom many of you will know, took me to central China, and we stood up on a ridge and we looked one way and it was all dust and desert, and we looked the other way and it was all green. And this was in large measure as a result of applying on major scale changes in industrial practices, and of course putting in place the incentive and finance structures which make that happen. So I think there's an enormous amount we can do, and we can do it on scale. And some parts of it would have to be done on scale, because if you're just managing little bits of the Amazon forest or little bits of a complicated water system, you won't get the returns you need unless you integrate it and put it all together in a major way. So I think there's an enormous amount we can do there on the resilience side, both in land and forest and water areas, but also in cities themselves.
So if I can also add a couple of points. First, I fully agree with you, Florence. Even if we were to stop emitting any ton of greenhouse gas today, we are already committed to a significant amount of climate damage. As I mentioned during my presentation, why we thought 20 years ago that we had, let's say, that we will have to see an average global an increase in average global temperature of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius for ecosystems to disappear. Now we know that 2 degrees Celsius could be enough. So we are already committed to significant climate damage, and it's extremely important to to scale up action in terms of adaptation and ecosystem protection and restoration. The Green Climate Fund allocates about 30% of its resources to nature-based solutions, and we are most likely to increase this percentage in the coming years. Now, one of the most important things is to ensure that we develop very strong synergies between mitigation, adaptation, and development. When we speak about, let's say, new green building codes, we are not only speaking about energy efficient buildings in order to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas being emitted. We are also speaking about buildings that withstand better heat wave, and we are also speaking about reducing the energy poverty. So a green building code is something that will deliver benefits on the mitigation side, on the adaptation side, and on the development side. And that's the same thing for ecosystem protection and restoration. We invest in ecosystem protection and restoration not only for soil organic carbon sequestration. We also do it in order to reduce the likelihood of flood and droughts. We also do it in order to maintain sources of livelihood for the most vulnerable population. So ecosystem protection and restoration, a good ecosystem protection and restoration project is the project that will basically maximize, optimize the co-benefits between mitigation, adaptation, and development. And when we get a project as the Green Climate Fund, it's one of the first things we look at. Are we maximizing the development benefits? I've mentioned that we had 6 investment criteria. One of the 6, as I've mentioned, is about paradigm shifting potential, capacity to reach scale. But another of the 6 is sustainable development and development co-benefits. We believe that if we could basically move from a silo approach to an integrated policy approach, we could reduce the total amount of resources, investment capital needed to meet the Paris Agreement by almost 50%. That was it at stake with promoting integrated policy development. Now, if it's so great, why are we doing so little? One of the problems is that most of our model to catalyze finance, most of our blended finance model to de-risk investment works very well for renewable energy technologies, works very well for some type of mitigation. And it's not a surprise, it's not surprising that my examples were actually linked to renewable energy technologies, because that's the best example for blended finance. Our blended finance works much less for adaptation and ecosystem restoration. And one of our greatest ambition in GCF is to make blended finance work for seeds, work for LDCs, work for adaptation, works for ecosystem protection. And we hope to be able to launch, for example, the first equity coral reef fund next year.
Thank you very much, Yannick and Lord Stern. We have, I believe, exhausted questions for now for the first half of the session. And I would like to sincerely thank you for your time in joining us for this forum, giving very insightful remarks and speeches. And we would like to now move to the next part of the session. And I'd like to invite my co-chair, Amar Bhattacharya, now to please take over. Amar, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, Yannick.
Thank you, George, for conducting that session. I think it has given us a great power of food for thought and is a great basis for the next part of what we will discuss. We have really 2 exceptional speakers to guide us in the next session, and I will take just a minute to introduce them. The first speaker is Bella Tonconnery, and the second speaker is Mark Sadler. They will pick up very much on what we discussed, but take it in more detail, and I'll come to that. But let me introduce them. So Bella is Associate Director of the Climate Policy Initiative at CPI, as many of us call it. She has played a leading role in the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance and the city's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. She will be speaking primarily of lessons from the first. She has previously served as a policy advisor in the US Treasury, overseeing the agency's energy and environment investments in emerging markets, and has also served as a staff economist at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Bella is an expert on sustainable finance and holds an MBA from MIT and from the Sloan School of Management, and an MSc from Imperial College London, so straddling two continents. Our second lead speaker is Mark Sadler. Mark is the manager of the Climate Funds Management Unit at the World Bank. The unit manages the climate and carbon trust funds housed at the World Bank, which are really quite large, and they cover land use, forestry, renewable energy, energy efficiency, as well as the relationship with the Montreal Protocol, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. His previous roles with the World Bank were as advisor on risk and markets and the global lead for climate smart agriculture in the Agriculture Global Practice. Mark has also worked in the past as a consultant for the World Bank and the FAO, with coverage on Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Turkey on issues related to agribusiness and sector policy. Prior to this, he was a commodities trader based in the former Soviet Union. He has an MA in jurisprudence from Trinity College, Oxford University. So, and they are really both been very, very actively involved, both in terms of practice, but also in terms of thought leadership. So I think we have excellent speakers, and I'm going to first turn to Bella, who is going to talk about the lessons from the Climate Finance Lab. So Bella, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Amar. Nice to see you, and thanks to everybody for joining today. Let me just see, will you be putting up the slides, or should I share my screen?
I can show your slides, Bella.
Okay, sure. So, well, I'll just get started while she's putting them up. So, if you could just move on to the next one, please. So I'm just going to start with a few slides about why we ended up doing this, doing some work on scale. In particular, what I'm going to present today is an issue brief that we've been working on for the last year or so, trying to bring together some of our understanding of scale that we've learned through a program that we run that Amar mentioned, called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. So just so you know who we are, my organization, CPI, focuses on three work areas. So first, understanding the state of climate finance. Secondly, how to more effectively deploy resources, in particular public resources, to mobilize private investment. And finally, we use this knowledge to help develop solutions that could be transformative towards an inclusive, low carbon, resilient economy. So next slide, please. Under the transformative solutions area, we manage the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is an incubator, and I'll explain it on the next slides. So the lab started in 2014 with the recognition that climate finance flows fall far below the investment needed each year to reach a 1.5 degree warming scenario. One of the implications of this is that we need the limited public investment to do a better job mobilizing private investment. Next slide. So the lab was launched by several governments and philanthropies to fill this gap, and specifically to identify, develop, and launch innovative finance instruments that can drive billions in private investment to action on climate change and sustainable development. And to date, we've incubated 49 solutions with the help of more than 80 lab member institutions from both the public and private sectors. And these solutions, in turn, have mobilized more than $2.2 billion. Next slide, please. So these solutions tackle investment barriers in many sectors and across emerging market regions. And just to underline here, when we say we're an incubator, we're not focused on technology. We're incubating financial instruments. So we've helped develop bonds, insurance products, project preparation facilities, securitization vehicles. And these financial instruments are actually intended at their core to help with scale. So next slide. And the way it works is that we start annually with a call for ideas, a rigorous selection process. Then we go through a 6-month period of stress testing and pilot development, and finally an endorsement and launch of the instruments. And it takes typically a few years after this lab process for these instruments to really get going. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So on the next slide, actually you can just move to the next one. So we've had a number of successes, and of course, as an incubator, we've also had some innovations that didn't make it. But we've been around now for 6 years, and we're starting to see a few of the earlier instruments start to scale up. So they have gone through this first implementation, and some of them are starting to be moving towards replication. But it is a small part of our record to date, mostly because we haven't been around for that long. But we're starting to ask now, well, what can we do to help make scale up happen faster? There's not that much time to address climate change. We really want to make sure that the solutions that we're incubating can mobilize more and more finance more and more quickly, and really kind of see the on the ground results that would result from that. So this project that I'm talking about today was kindly supported by one of our lab funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, to look at that. And what we did was we really focused on what's within an innovator's control. So this project isn't about broader systemic or policy change. And we do some of that work separately at CPI, but this with the lab is really focused on what can an innovator control and how can we help them in order to get them along this pathway to scale up and replication and scale up more quickly. So on the next slide, what we did for this project or this brief is first to identify case studies from the lab's early instruments. So which ones are in the process or have been replicated, and combine that with a review of the literature on scale. And we looked both at development literature as well as the entrepreneurship literature. And from that process, we developed 4 success factors. And then we've compared that to what we're doing in the lab process. So how are we actually working with these entrepreneurs, and through that develop recommendations that both we can use in the lab as well as that others that we work with, other stakeholders, maybe they can also work more effectively too. So I'll just on the next slide, just start to present some of the success factors. So sorry, I have a small animation in this one, but if you could, just advance one, that would be great. So the first success factor is super obvious. It's just that if you're going to scale, you have to prove your concept by establishing a track record. And the key here, though, I think for us is understanding upfront how you know when you've proven your concept and how to do that as quickly as possible. So in the lab, we deal with a lot of long-term models. So for example, a private equity fund might have a 12-year life cycle, or a forestry securitization might, it takes 15 years for the trees to mature. And so that's a long time to wait to see whether that financial instrument actually worked. So what we think about a lot are what are the intermediate milestones that can substitute for waiting for that full life cycle, and can we define those milestones and measure them? So for a private equity fund, the intermediate milestone might be reaching first close. So when you get your first round of investments agreed, and also making your first investments into companies or on the ground projects. So the second one, if you could, thank you, is finding then economies of scale. So how do you consistently generate more impact per dollar invested over time? So in the literature, it talks a lot about, do you have to scale the whole thing, or can you take the core of it and replicate that at lower cost? Or can you standardize certain elements like contracts? Can you reduce your marginal cost of acquiring pipeline? Third, then, is the team and organization. This came up a lot in the literature. So is it the right team with the right skill set and network? Will the project's champions stay to see it through? Does the governance model meet best practices? And then fourth and finally is partnerships. So critical to any innovation and for innovative finance as well, it's about having the right partners on board as early as possible, both for your pipeline, so making sure that you have enough projects and companies to invest in, and for funders, so you have lower transaction costs. And one of my favorite examples of this is from a colleague of mine who developed the Forest Resilience Bond in the US, which helps reduce fire risk and restore forests. They started out with a plan to work with small landowners in the West, and then they realized if they could get the US Forest Service on board, they'd actually have access to millions of acres of land with just one partner. So it took more work up front for them to get that partnership, but then it costs less with every additional acre that they invest in. So on the next slide, I'm just going to speak briefly about how these success factors have applied to 3 case studies of instruments that we've helped develop in the lab. And these are all from the first year of the program, 2015. So it has been this 5 or 6 year process for these instruments to get where they are today. So this one on this slide is called Energy Savings Insurance. It was developed by the Inter-American Development Bank, and it aims to address investment barriers to energy efficiency upgrades at small and medium enterprises. And it addresses these barriers. Basically, it just pays out if the projected value of energy savings is not realized. It's just standard insurance product applied to a new situation. So this instrument was first demonstrated and replicated in small pilots in a few countries in Latin America. And then the concept gained momentum, and in 2018 was approved by the Green Climate Fund for a scale up with the National Development Banks of Argentina and Paraguay. The concept has also been replicated in Europe by a completely separate entity, the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, and the French Development Agency is conducting a feasibility study to apply this in countries in Africa and Asia. And this instrument has benefited from a few points consistent with the success factors I mentioned. So one is that they've standardized their contracts to make it easier to adopt it quickly in new countries. They've taken advantage of their pre-existing relationships with National Development Bank clients as well to roll this out quickly across the region. And then the last thing is we asked BASE, the European implementer, about how they learned about the model, and they told us they just heard about it at a conference they went to and decided to implement it. They liked the idea, and it was a compact enough innovation that they could literally kind of take the core of the idea and bring it into a new context fairly easily. And the IDB has actually developed a package of information to help other implementers do that. So then on the next slide, this instrument is called Long-Term Foreign Exchange Risk Management, which is a mouthful, so we just generally call it TCX, which is the company that manages this. So this instrument is about currency risk, which is one of the most significant and persistent barriers to climate investment in developing countries. So TCX helps to make more projects attractive through a hedging mechanism that they run. And before coming to the lab, they were already an existing company that had been established by a group of multilateral development banks. So maybe one of the kinds of partnerships that Lord Stern was talking about, you know, how can MDBs get together for bigger change and bigger projects. And the lab process is really focused on understanding how the instrument could apply to climate change. So as you can see on this slide, they quickly used a $30 million investment from the German Ministry of Environment, BMU, to raise additional investment, and then hedged $230 million in climate-related finance. And then BMU, who has been a really important long-term strategic partner for them, then increased their commitment an additional 20 million euros to allow for more hedging. And what I think is especially interesting about this example is that at this point, TCX is fully, or that climate change is fully mainstreamed in TCX's operations. They've been raising large amounts of finance recently for development, and not specifically for climate, but a lot of the work that they do is in climate. They just see it as part of their broader portfolio. And they also have told us that they really believe that their work has helped to increase awareness of foreign exchange risks in the market and helping the overall renewable energy sector become more resilient. So then on the last case study is Climate Investor One, which actually you already heard about from Yannick at the GCF, which had a really crucial investment in this facility. So it provides, it is a whole of life cycle facility, as he mentioned, providing funding for early stage project development, construction, and refinancing. And they have raised $850 million, actually far beyond their original target of $530 million, and really helped by that GCF investment, which unlocked hundreds of millions of dollars in private investment that was waiting actually for that concessional funding. So without that GCF funding, they would have ended up a much smaller facility. So what they're doing now is they're actually working on Climate Investor 2, which is replicating the same structure and the same way of working, but focusing on the water, oceans, and sanitation sectors. And one of the other interesting things about this fund is that, or this facility, is that it's run as a JV of a development agency, of the Dutch development agency, and a private company. So they've also seen this Dutch development agency, FMO, really involved in this facility since the very beginning and continuing to stay involved. So really that strategic funding and technical partner throughout their time. So let me just end with a few recommendations on the next slide. I think you can just go and show all of them at once so I can wrap up. So there's just one more. Thank you. So we created some recommendations here. I won't go through all of them. I think we probably are running a little bit over time, but I think really what we're trying to understand here is, how can we do our job better at the lab, and how can other stakeholders help us do that job better? Some of the things are around track record, and one of the issues we've had, or one of the challenges we've had in the lab, is that a lot of our entrepreneurs, it takes them a couple years after the lab process just to raise money to keep going. And so having access to early stage seed capital is really important, but it's really missing in the market, or it's not sufficient in the market, let's say. And then I think the other points on this slide I've already gone through, so I will just wrap up here. Let me just, if you just go to the next slide, just to thank you all for your attention. If you are interested in the lab, please feel free to reach out. We actually have a call for ideas open now until December 22nd. And we will be presenting, or I'll be presenting this work with some of the case studies later in November when we actually launch this publication. So we'll also be happy to share that information too. So thanks so much, and back over to you, Amar.
Thank you, Bella. I mean, The work of the lab is actually exactly what we are trying to achieve here. So, it's great to have your lab and, to be able to both draw on it, but also I hope to, in some sense, amplify the messages coming out of the lab. So I thought the success factors that you identified give us something concrete, and the case studies something even more tangible to apply them to. So we'll come back, I'm sure, to some questions that people may have. Just want to thank you at this stage. And let me turn to Mark Sadler, who will actually make a very complimentary presentation. He will be talking more about, not the instruments, but more transformative climate finance using a systemic approach. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amar. So if we could bring up the presentation, a lot of this we were talking around systemic approaches. How do we drive transformation through systemic approaches? So obviously that conversation can sometimes get a bit esoteric. So as a specific example, I'm using this, which came from a paper that we actually released last year, which is really focusing on how is it that we can leverage clearly the resources that aren't enough. And maybe if we go to that first slide, we can see what the challenge is that's before us. Can we move that slide forwards? Excellent. So the big challenge that we have is that the amount of what we refer to as dedicated climate finance is very, very small when we look at the size of the global challenge. And quite often the problem when we look at those types of challenges is that we end up with, as opposed to transformation, we end up with incrementalism, we end up with system lockdown. So when we look at what that challenge looks like, we thought about, okay, what is it that it will actually take to drive that change? So if we can move to the next slide. So the question then becomes, okay, transformation's not, at the global scale is going to come because of country action. It's going to come because economies fundamentally change the way that they develop and that they manage themselves. So when you think about it in that way and you start breaking the system out, you look at what are the levers that will actually drive that transformative climate action. And traditionally, what we've really focused on, of course, is projects. Now, if we're investing that 3 billion or the 60 billion into projects each year in the face of a $4 trillion challenge, projects won't be enough to get us there. So then what are the other levers in the system, in the economy, that we can seek to influence, that we can seek to move, that can drive transformative change? Now, obviously there are a lot of levers, and we picked for transformative climate action, so 8 of those. There are many more, but we're really trying to draw out what were the biggest levers that the Minister of Finance, that the whole of government can look at to try and drive the change. It's also useful for FDI, for foreign direct investment, but also for foreign investors, bilateral financiers, to look at, okay, we have limited resources, how can we have the maximum impact? Projects are obviously part of that, but there are these other levers that can drive change. And of course, as we know, this isn't just an issue of technology, it is an issue of changing whole industries and the just transition. So the political economy runs throughout. So finding the levers and identifying those, and then thinking about, well, how could public finance, blended finance, private finance flow to these levers to drive change at a greater scale, but at a greater speed as well. So the next slide, thanks. So when we look at this, as always, of course, we need to come up with some form of a methodology, understanding how the lever works within the economy, understanding what those barriers are And so what is it that we can apply finance or policy, political economics to overcome barriers to change today? Thirdly, how is it that climate finance, specific dedicated climate finance, can play into that space to have a catalytic effect? And then obviously the conclusion comes about how you take a systemic approach at the country, economy, even regional level to drive this set of actions forwards. Next slide. So I won't go through these. This will be made available to everyone, but this is just sort of an overview of what we were really talking about when we were talking about the levers and what lies within. But one of the important ones, I think, that's now really coming through in the past couple of years especially, is this deeper focus and much more active discussion and engagement in and around the role of the financial sector. Not just where finance flows and how to incentivize private capital to flow to the greener things, but also then how we're looking at systemic risk, which of course is all about resilience and adaptation, but also about what is it that these capital flows in the long term look like in terms of actual financial risk. So not just the risk of an investment to a natural disaster or lack of adaptation, but also investment in assets that essentially face a risk of devaluation due to the sector technology approach that they are in. And we're seeing a very interesting interplay here with the TCFD, but also with central bank regulators. Because what we're looking at here is systemic financial risk. Again, not just to risks of what variables within weather or within other natural risks that are driven by the lack of adaptation, but also the systemic financial risks about where the economy is investing its money and how that is valued over the longer time, because that is what we'd call a sort of a low, slow burning fuse issue that you need to address now. You need to start affecting capital flows much earlier on to avoid the type of financial collapses that come when you try and move capital away from difficult situations at speed. And you think back to sort of 2008 and sort of mortgage-backed securities. That's a great example of how rapid movement from one asset class because of underlying risk can create major financial systemic issues. So if we move to the next slide, here also bringing in trade policy, it's interesting to see we're now starting to see much more active discussion around carbon border taxes. A lot more jurisdictions are now looking at what are the embedded emissions in their imports. UK at the moment is looking very seriously, especially at the agricultural side of its imports, and what's actually embedded there. On the one hand, they're heavily investing in trying to slow down and cease deforestation, and yet at the same time, the food industry is importing large amounts of crude palm oil, for example, or palm oil embedded in products that come from areas that are really driving deforestation. So we're starting to see some of this regulatory issues become much more to the forefront, and innovation and tech transfer, which it's often there, but we don't see large amounts of public capital necessarily moving towards it, and certainly not seeing it in a bigger, broader context of where else public finance may flow. So we go to the next slide. Thank you. Can we move on to the next one, or are we? There we go. And then the last ones, and one which of course is, what will play, and yesterday I was in a conversation with the Climate Finance Conference in Paris, in and around the future of as old nomenclature, I think, carbon markets, both voluntary and the sovereign future of results-based systems that are paying for reductions in emissions or carbon capture. And then one particular piece that often gets lost and doesn't end up on the table is if we don't have the data, we can't really work out what we're going to need to do. We cannot do long-term strategies if we don't have enough sufficient climate intelligence and data. And this is quite often the one that really struggles to bring in enough finance. But without that knowledge, without that data, without that science, it's difficult for us to actually be making trillion-dollar investments today with the kind of surety and knowledge that we actually need. So the next slide, thank you. So what are the, what are some of the recommendations that also came out of that related thinking? Really, this focus on long-term strategies, very difficult. Political cycles tend to be 4 or 5 years, but transformative action, very difficult to do in 4 or 5 years. And if we keep on changing our policy direction every 4 or 5 years, trying to achieve Paris becomes very, very difficult. Paris really can't be achieved by building blocks of 5-year NDCs. You have to have a clear idea of what that long-term strategy looks like, and then build from that what you are going to do within that next segment of time, the NDCs. So long-term strategies, it's increasing, we're seeing an increase in interest around the LTS. A lot of our clients are now realizing and starting to focus on how do you drive the LTS, and then how does that then relate to these 5-year planning cycles, essentially the NDCs. The second piece of that is how do you actually go about thinking through those levers? And the reality is that I think the smallest unit that you can really deal with is a country. Once you start aggregating up, it becomes very difficult because the specificity of how you're going to invest and how these different investments will interact is really the best unit for deciding that is at a country level, at an economy level, as opposed to necessarily regional or global. At least to start with. Obviously, you have regional agreements related to trade or related to water usage, hydro and energy usage, etc. Then those can play in, but certainly the bedrock is at the country level. Clearly, and Yannick was referring to it, and the Green Climate Fund is a great example. We need to start using these different financial instruments together. We need to bring these things together. It's about financial leverage, but it's about instrument leverage as well. Different liquidity for different things. And obviously the whole pitch, which was about systemic basis and wider. You've got the next slide. I think we're pretty much through. I think the one to just pull out of this again, the political economy. We really do need to convince policymakers why this low carbon resilient economy is better than the other options that are on the table today. And that, 20% of that may be a technical discussion. 40% of that may be a financial discussion. But a big chunk of that is a political economic discussion. How are you managing the just transition? How are you enabling these different sectors to come together? And how are you managing trade-offs? Sometimes these are clear decisions. Solar is a great example at the moment. In most jurisdictions, it's cheaper than coal. That's why we're seeing a big swing. But in others, it's not. There is a delta. There's an implied cost. So how are we going to manage that? How are we going to invest? How do we transition people, not just the economy, to this next step? And then I think it's the next slide. Proposed next step. So what we're looking at the moment, of course, is deepening our knowledge. We'll actually be doing a deep dive into the transport sector. It's somewhere that's traditionally hard to get at, of course, especially the emissions reductions, investments today, long-term emissions reductions, how are we capitalizing those? and then picking a couple of countries to really look at this and work with the Ministry of Finance, Economics, the whole of government, to really see where their current flows are, what their trajectories are, what their LTS is starting to look like, and how they can start bringing in external finance and their own domestic public finance to drive these changes in a structured way over time. So I'll leave it there, Amar. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So we have had what I call the bookends of a very productive framing. I'll save my remarks to the end because we are a little bit short of time. I want to hear from people. And in addition to kind of questions to Mark and to Bella and to Mark, I really ask you for your thoughts on what this practice should productively focus on. It was very good, this is our second meeting, and we have these one very macro way of looking at the challenge, one very concrete, how do we produce change on the ground? In some sense, Yannick spoke in the middle and about scalability and replicability in terms of connecting the two. But what I'd like to do is open the floor up right now and see if there are questions. And as Johannes has shown, there's also a way to communicate via the chat. So please, if you could put up your hands and indicate whether you want to speak or not. And Katie, I'd appreciate if you could just flag to me if there are any questions that I'm missing. There seems to be overwhelming silence. So let me read you Johannes's question. It is, as you noted, more complete climate observation and data delivery, especially in LICs and SIDS, is critical. This requires support for investment and operation and maintenance for the LICs and SIDS, a gap so far that needs to be filled at scale and urgently, hence the nascent, the observatory initiative of WMO. Johannes, do you want to mention a word on that? And then, if Mark could respond. Go ahead, Johannes.
No, thank you, Amar, for bringing that up, that question up. I just wanted to get Mark's feedback, and maybe others also, whether it's Bella or if they're still online, Yannick's and Lord Stern's views on how important this data issue is that Mark raised. In my particular aspect, because I've recently gotten involved with the World Meteorological Organization and their new initiative, especially targeted at improving data gathering, weather data gathering on the ground in LICs and SIDS. Whether or not you actually see this as an important part of the puzzle that we need to put together urgently. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. If I could add a question, Mark, to you, and also one to you, Bella. My question to you, Mark, is you've put forward these ideas of levers, and you've emphasized very, correctly, in my personal view, the importance of country action, because those are the building blocks. But there's also a way to using coalitions of players to move the needle. And we are seeing increasingly these forming. The coalition of finance ministers on climate action, in which the bank has been playing a key role together with the IMF. The network of greening the financial systems, a large number of coalitions in the private sector, CFLI, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, lots happening in the urban space, and tremendous amount of, the initiative on, the last case study that Bella mentioned. So one question I have is, although these initiatives exist, how can we get more coherence and synergy, and particularly right now, how can we get more out of the private sector? Be very interested in both Mark and Bella's thoughts on that. How do we engage the private sector much more in a systemic way, but also in the down-to-earth way that Bella was talking about? How do we take that FX scaling, to really now much higher limits? What do you think are the next steps? So those are two additional questions from me. I don't see any other questions. So let me turn it over to you, Mark and Bella.
Okay, maybe I'll dive in. On the WMO and the observation facility, I think this is a really good example of how a focus on one issue can drive so many co-benefits. How something is critical to so many other pieces of a system. As I mentioned, you can't do long-term strategies unless you have really good climate data. And that is both, it is a personal good for a farmer to know and have much better data projections. It's good for a county government to know because of basically their planning. It's good for a government to know because of insurance and healthcare systems and social protection. It's good at a regional level for water sharing arrangements. It's good at a continental level. I mean, at all levels, a renewed vigor around the issue of weather and climate observation will drive benefits. It's a challenging one, and I think partly inherent in the current system is a challenge, where this has always been based on Earth observation. It's based upon ministries that, in political economic terms, are not actually at the top of the space. I think there is a real opportunity here to put this subject in the right context, and for the other stakeholders who currently don't realize how dependent they are on weather and climate observation, for them to understand, for them to be able to then make the investment decisions that are required. Important as well that there needs to be a bit of a change in the current way it's done. This is the public sector crashing into the private sector, and we need to find new public-private ways forwards. This is a sector that has traditionally been challenged by this. Even in some of the biggest countries in the continental US, I mean, the sharing of data and the relationship between the private sector and NOAA, for example, is challenging. We see that in every country. So yes, extremely important. And it's just one of those core bedrock issues that we need to address. On coalitions, Amar, I think they fulfill different functions and different purposes. They're great for sharing knowledge. They're great for raising ambition, be that public or private. Good coalitions also tend to be a bit infectious. And if it's a good coalition and it's a good club, everyone wants to get in. So in doing that, we need to ensure that we have coalitions that leverage, that focus on action, and follow what their deliverables are. And the Finance Ministers Coalition was a great example. The reason for bringing it about was to bring them into this conversation, because this is about how we plan for the economies of the next decades. The people who are head and center of that conversation are the ministers of finance. And yet most of the conversations about climate were with the ministers of environment, who have technical knowledge, but they're not planning what the economy is. So that coalition has very clear delivery at the moment, and certainly in terms of sharing knowledge, raising awareness, but also raising ambition. It's great to see some of these countries coming in and really, pushing out their agendas, and others saying, okay, that's interesting. How did you manage the political economics of that? And so they're utterly invaluable. On the private sector, we're starting to see those coalesce already. I think the key, having come out of the private sector myself, the key there is really, what are you going to do? When are you going to do it? how much is it going to cost? What's going to be they have to be action focused. And then when they come together with the public sector, I think it's really important that we talk, that we find a common language. Quite often, public sector wonks like myself talk in terms that the private sector sort of think, that's a bit too esoteric for me. What are we actually going to get done? So, you know, Mark Carney's task force at the moment on the future of voluntary carbon markets is a great activity to bring people together, increase their knowledge, increase their ambition, but also find some real practical ways forwards. And then we need to feed into that, but we need to feed into that in a constructive way that brings the knowledge and the experience of what's been going on before, again, in a constructive way. It's very easy to say why it can't be done. Let's focus on how it can be done, because that's what the private sector do, right? They do things. They don't sit around saying why it can't be. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Bella?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amar. Thanks, Mark. So just to add a little bit on the private sector side, and actually kind of going on from what, you know, the question about data, I think data is one of the key areas that help to enable private investment as well. So for example, if you want to have an insurance product for agricultural or climate risk for agriculture, you need years of data to price that product. So if you don't have any data, then you can't have an insurance product, and then you can't address the climate risk. So I think there is, so data is actually really critical, and it's a key area where concessional finance can help to bridge that gap between when you don't have data and when you actually have the data to be able to develop the product. And other things, you know, you need big projects, big investment opportunities. It's why Climate Investor One has been successful. A lot of investors don't wake up in the morning for less than $100 million, especially the big pension funds, institutional investors. So you do need to have aggregated vehicles that actually match their investment profiles. You need good projects, and this is something that has been discussed for a long time. It's just you need bankable projects. There's a big role for government in particular in developing strong projects and for technical assistance to support project preparation facilities to actually make them investable. And then you need risk finance as well. So you need things like guarantees or early stage finance that helps then de-risk projects, especially pilots, so that private investors can come in. So those are some of the things on the private sector side. I also wanted to address, there's a question in the chat about social impact. So I did want to address that as well, because I think, you know, it's one of the issues we actually haven't talked about much today, which is kind of shocking given the year we're in. It's just about COVID and the recovery, and actually how important it is today to think about social impacts, not only from a safeguard perspective, sort of the do no harm perspective, but how actually we can use the investments that we're making to really drive, to really provide benefits to society, to communities, to low income, vulnerable people, to women, many of whom have lost jobs disproportionately this year as compared to men. So I think there is just a lot of room for integrating how we think about recovery on the environmental side and climate side with social side. And actually there's a lot of work going on now identifying, and Lord Servan, you yourself have done some of that, identify sort of what are the multipliers and what are the effects, what are the actual interventions that can be used that can address multiple benefits. And I think where we're going, at least at CPI, is we've been developing a coalition that is trying to bridge the coalition. So we've been developing something called the Principles for Financing the Sustainable Recovery. We're actually trying to bring together, for the first time, actors across the financial system, also representatives from civil society, to come together to think about actually how we can transform the way we do finance at a bigger level, and really kind of addressing all of the impacts of sustainability in terms of economic, environmental, and social. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bella. I'm not going to take more time, but let me just make a couple concluding points just to help drive this discussion forward. I think it's fair to say that climate action is probably the most complex space of collective action in the world. Okay, I think that's fair to say. I also think that one aspect in which climate is different than others is the shrinking window for time of action because of the carbon budget and because of lock-in of bad investments. Every time you make a bad investment, you lock in. And if I put it in a simple way, if you look at the existing capital stock of the world and you did nothing, it will eat up the carbon budget of the world. And yet, in the next 20 years, we have to double that capital stock. That's a good macro framing of the challenge we face. But at the same time, as Bella pointed out, and as the question posed by Claire makes, action will only happen when we are able to connect the high global and macro level to the very local levels in tackling this problem. So I think it will be very useful in thinking about our future work, about how we do this. And that gives me a perfect segue to hand this over back to George, who can help us think a little bit about the next steps forward. Over to you, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your presentations and questions. This has been a wonderful opportunity. This is the very first time for this working group on climate change to get together during these interesting times, albeit virtual meeting. I think we've all had a very fruitful discussion, and we very much look forward to the next engagements and many more to come. We hope so. This was the sixth and final event of this year's annual workshop of the Global Communities of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes. And with this, the 2020 gatherings have concluded. And we very much hope that early next year in 2021, we will have another opportunity to get together as a community to discuss some of the findings of other member organizations of this community of practice. We will be in touch. We will follow up with an email. We will circulate a brief summary of outcomes, whether it will go through the email net that we used or through Johannes and the team. That will be decided, I believe, with the colleagues, but you will all hear back from us on today's meeting as well as next steps. With this, I would like to once again thank you, everyone. Amar, it's been a pleasure co-chairing this meeting with you. Johannes, thank you very much once again for your continuous support and for helping us establish a very important community of practitioners and analysts. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the events team, Katie and Teresa, who've been working tirelessly to support this meeting. And very special thanks to my colleagues, particularly Andrew Hollander, who worked very hard to support me and my colleagues in making this event possible, as well as Leila, who's in the office at past midnight, helping us with this. So with this, once again, many thanks, and we will see you soon again. Johannes or Amar, would you like to say any concluding remarks with these, or are we good to adjourn the meeting?
I think we are good on my side to adjourn, but maybe Johannes, as our overall guru, might want to say something.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I've been so pleased with this meeting and the fact that we've gotten this this initiative and the working group off to a good start. And I'm just looking forward to continued engagement with you all. And thank you all for making it happen. Thank you, and have a great day, a great weekend. And we'll see each other again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.